Welcome to the Parsha Pairings with Jeff and Sherry. I'm Jeff Friedlander.
And I'm Sherry Friedlander. And if you like the Parsha Pairings, we want to ask you to subscribe to our channel. And please do like and share the video so we can spread the word. And while you're there, go ahead and click the little bell so you'll receive notifications every time we post a new video.
This week's Parsha is out of Leviticus starting in chapter 9. It's called Shemini, which means eighth. It's Leviticus chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 47. The Haftorah this week is 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 17. And the Brit Hadashah is Matthew 3, 11 through 17, Hebrews 7, 1 through 19, and chapter 8 of Hebrews, 1 through 6. This week's Parsha gets its name from the verse, "On the 8th day Moses summoned Aaron and his sons and the elder of Israel." The ceremony that began in our last Parsha is now on day 8. 7 in Hebrew numerology is the number of completion. 8 is a day of new beginnings. So we have now moved from the day of completing the ceremonies to a day of new beginnings, and that's where we jump off. Sherry?
So now one thing we want to remember is that this system that God is setting up is unprecedented in the cultures around them. Most of the sacrifices that were done in the pagan nations were a way to garner favor from their God, not to korban, to draw near to their God. So we see this whole system is set up in a holy and unique way compared to the pagan nations. The chapter opens in chapter 9. We see a lot more offerings being done. We see the chatat offering, which is that sin offering. We see lambs and goats and bulls being given. We see all kinds of things happening in that world. But what we want to focus on here is, first of all, in verse 2, we see something interesting that happens. Up until now, we've heard Adonai speak to Moses, and then he tells Aaron. Here in verse 2, we have, then he, speaking of Adonai, said to Aaron, "Take a calf from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering, both without blemish, and offer them before Adonai." And it goes on to describe what he's to do. We see Adonai actually speaking to Aaron now.
Yeah, so we see that we've come through 7 days, but prior to that, we've built the tabernacle. We've consecrated it with offerings, blood offerings that have been sprinkled all over all the elements and the tabernacle itself. We've consecrated the priest. We've set them aside. And now on day 8, all of a sudden, new beginnings means now I'm not going to talk just to Moses. We're beginning the Levitical priesthood in its professional grade way, right? It's, as Sherry mentioned in one of our other videos, we're now open for business. In other words, we're now going in. So now I'm going to talk directly to the high priest, and the high priest is Aaron. I'm going to speak to him.
And he says at the end of verse 4 a very, very powerful thing. He said, "For today Adonai appears to you." So you're going to do all of this on this 8th day, and now Adonai is going to appear to you. We also know that something interesting to take note in verse 8, Aaron comes to the altar and slaughters the calf as a sin offering for himself. The first thing he does is this offering for himself. Now this is that chatat, that's the word used there. But then in verse 12, he also brings the burnt offering, the olah offering. So what we see Aaron doing before he even begins the next process of sacrifices, he's bringing that olah offering, where he's offering all of himself before the Lord, and the chatat, where any unintentional sins that he may have committed over these last 7 days, on this 8th day, it's a cleansing totally of his sin nature, the offering of himself, and any unintentional sins that he's committed.
Which is a beautiful picture of us wanting to say, Lord, when we come to you, may you cleanse us from that which we don't know we need to be cleansed from, the nature of us. And also, Lord, we give ourselves to you fully. We give ourselves fully, and we commit to be your priest. Also, Aaron's sons are here now.
Right.
They're with him, and they're beginning to help. They're passing the blood, and they're doing this
Right.
with him. And so they're working in it as well. And in verse 18, we read that he brings an offering that now is for the people. So now he's done an offering for himself. His sons are helping. He's offered his nature, and now he goes and gets a goat, and he's offering it for the people, which is the Yom Kippur national sacrifice.
Right, which we learn in Yom Kippur is exactly that. That's
Yeah.
a goat offering. There's two
Yeah.
goats, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about that when we get to Yom Kippur, but we get introduced to this goat
Yeah.
in connection to the national sin offering.
Yeah, Yom Kippur is a national where he's been doing personal sacrifices as we're talking about, and now there's a national one.
Now, he also does a slaughtering of ox and rams for peace offerings for the people. So you've got this offering being given of the goat for the national atonement, and then also for peace. So we're seeing all these. We went so laboriously through all this Korban system, learning about these different offerings, and now we're seeing how they're all being used here in this inauguration of or consecration of the priest.
And it says in verse 23 that Moses and Aaron went out of the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. That's a pretty powerful moment.
It really is.
I mean, think about that just for a second, right? Wouldn't you love if you went to a service and when the pastor or the rabbi came out, all of a sudden you looked and the glory of God showed up? I mean,
yeah.
that's better than going down to the Cracker Barrel, as we say here in, in Alabama, right? That's incredible to think about. So don't miss those moments, right? The glory of the Lord appeared. And then it says, Sherry, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering, the fat portions on the altar. And when the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell face down.
Wow. Now, I think what's interesting to know, there's two things here. One, this is about a year after their first appearance at Mount Sinai, when that fire, they see the fiery mountain, and their response was fear.
Yeah.
They said, no, Moses, you go take care of that. I'm not going, we're too afraid. You go talk to God. And now we see them, they're shouting for joy because they recognize the presence. Something in this year has transpired in this building of the tabernacle, this gathering, giving of their offerings, because now they've come through this year of building together as a community. And they've prepared a place for the presence of God. I think there's something very unique there for us to take into our own lives. That when we work together as a community in the building of a space, a sacred space for the presence of God, we may come in fear the first time. But when we gather together and you've got this building together, there's something very special about that brings us into a place of now we rejoice. This presence of God is the same. But now they're not afraid. The other interesting...
Well, let me jump on that real quick before you go to the second point. One thing that's very interesting to note is this word glory. Okay, this word glory is kavod in Hebrew, and it means, we translate it as glory. What it really is a picture of is weight. It's heavy. And when you take that word and you go through the scriptures, you find out that it usually represents things that are like an armament. It represents a bow or a shield. It represents something that is visibly seen. And every time we see this word, this glory of God on the earth, what we find is what we just read. They rejoiced in this case, but they fell face down.
Right.
The last time they were in fear, but they also fell face down. Many times this word, when you see this power, what you find is God himself is showing up, and he's coming down in a way, and when he comes down, the power, the presence is overwhelming. It's not
tangible.
It's not just a presence like most who are walking with God would say, I felt the presence of God. And sometimes we shout, sometimes we rejoice, sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, sometimes we get quiet. The presence always elicits many different types of responses. The glory, the kavod, is one response, face down, the weight of God. I call it the great equalizer. What the glory does is it puts everybody on the same plane.
That's right.
You lose all these battles we face in our flesh of race and arguing about different things. There's no blacks and whites and Asians.
Stations in life, economic status, all of those things, all are
It all goes away because
That's right.
everybody's face down. So this glory is a big deal, and when it hits, we're all going to want to be part of that. I would encourage us all. What Sherry said, this creating an atmosphere, creating a space. May we all say, Lord, are we creating a space where your glory can actually fall?
That's good. What is really cool about this, if we remember from our Parsha last week and even the week before when Moses was giving the instructions about the fire that was going to be on the altar, he said, may it never go out. You're to keep it lit continually. And I want to make note, something that we discovered as we were reading it this year. The fire came out from the presence of Adonai and devoured the burnt offering. What ignited it was the fire of God.
Yes.
So when you're thinking about this fire they're never to let go out, it's the fire God started. Right. He provided for the sacrifice. What God orders, he pays for.
Yes.
He put this whole Korban system in place.
Yes.
Moses, tell the people to do this, tell them to do that. I'm going to supply the fire for it. And isn't that such a beautiful picture of what happens when God comes into our lives? I mean, we think back to the day of Shavuot and Acts chapter 2, which many of us know as Pentecost.
Yes.
It again was God's fire that fell from heaven that lights us on fire for him. Yes. He gives us that fire of God. And we see that here, that this is what actually lights the altar fires.
Yeah, holy fire,
it's
baby.
A beautiful
holy
thing.
Fire. It is beautiful. So we move into chapter 10, Sherry, and the sons of Aaron, which is Nadab and Abihu. And for those who have never read this portion, it's probably one of the sadder chapters in the Torah. I mean, it's a pretty sad event that happens here. They bring what the Bible calls unauthorized fire. And we've described this fire, right? This is the fire of God. And God says, I put this fire here. I did it a certain way. And Nadab and Abihu, they run in. And they bring what God calls unauthorized fire. And when they do, it does not go well.
Well, it actually says in verse 2, so, at the end of verse 1, when they offered unauthorized fire before Adonai, which he had not commanded them. So fire came out from the presence of Adonai and consumed them also.
And they died before the Lord. So here's the thing. A minute ago, we see this fire. Aaron, his sons, which would have included them, right? His sons, Nadab and Abihu. Moses, they all come out from the tent. Fire comes down. Glory comes down. The fire lights the altar. Everybody falls face down and rejoices. Nobody dies. Not much time later, we don't know the exact time frame, they decide to go in and just do something without God's permission nor command. And by doing that, presumption has entered their heart.
Now, we have to be careful and not to be too quick to judge and go, oh, this is that mean Old Testament God. He burns people at the altar, right? When we fast forward to the first century and we read in Acts chapter 5, we read a very similar event that happens. We read about Ananias and Sapphira. And if you remember the story, they get a piece of land, they sell some property, they get some proceeds from it, and they agree together, we're going to keep a portion of it, which was fine. Yeah. There was nothing wrong with that. And we're going to take a portion into the community as an offering. But what they didn't do was tell the truth. They gave the impression that they were bringing all of the proceeds. Yeah. Now, it's interesting to note that it's okay that they didn't bring all of them. God's not upset with that. But when they get before the presence of God and they say, oh, here's our offering, Ananias goes first, and Peter says to him, why have you lied? Yeah. Why are you lying? I know you're lying. And Ananias dies straight on the spot. Yeah. They drag his body out, and about a few hours later, Sapphira comes in. Right. Same thing happens to her. We have this idea of bringing this lie, this unauthorized offering before the Lord, and they die. Now, this is first century.
Yeah, this is post resurrection.
So we see that it's not the mean Old Testament God and the good New Testament God. This is the holy God that does not allow these things in his presence, in his holiness. And if you're going to bring this offering to the Lord, you're going to bring something before the Lord, we need to bring it with a pure heart and a holy heart and a righteous heart.
Boy, it's such a wake-up call for us, Sherry. I mean, really it is. When you think about it, how many of us have spent so much time wondering why we may be sick, wondering why we may be in bad circumstances, or wondering why we don't seem to hear God, or God's not acting the way we would think he would act? I wonder, is there some unauthorized fire that we're taking before the Lord? Is there some unholy lies? Is there some things we're doing? So I would just encourage you, take a moment now. You can even pause this video. Take a moment and say, Father, have I offered unauthorized fire somewhere? Have I got some unauthorized stuff in me that I need you to clean up by the blood of Yeshua? The good news is he's gracious.
That's
right. The good news is he is love, and he wants to forgive. We're not required to always die. Sometimes we do, but God wants to bring us back into fellowship with him. And so I just encourage you to take a moment and ask him, help me to not have the unauthorized fire in my heart.
And right after this, God speaks something very interesting to Aaron. First of all, he doesn't allow the other brothers, his other sons, to touch these two bodies. They're not allowed to because, as we talked about in last week's Parsha, that would make them unclean. And these are newly consecrated priests, right? So they call in the cousins, who are not being anointed as priests, to drag the bodies outside the camp, because we learn later in Leviticus that you can't touch anything dead because it makes you unclean.
As the priest,
You have to carry it outside the camp. So they follow this protocol. But then God addresses Aaron again in verse 8. And he said, Adonai spoke to Aaron, saying, do not drink wine or fermented drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, so that you do not die. This is to be a statute forever throughout your generations. Now, that verse in and of itself, you can take a lot out of it. But when you tack it to the end of this story, it kind of makes you wonder, is God addressing maybe the sons were drunk? Maybe they weren't in their sober mind and they went and got fire from where they weren't supposed to. We don't know.
We don't know. Many of the sages have speculated that is what happened, because it's an odd place for God to put a command onto Aaron. And it's not that Aaron can't have wine or fermented drink ever. He can't have it and then go into the tabernacle where he works. So it had to be a separate issue. And here we see this command right at the point of his son's dying, and God says, okay, by the way, don't do this. So it does have a
Seems
tendency.
Like they're linked.
And the way the scriptures lay out, when you study ancient literature and you study the literature of the Torah, it definitely indicates that probably had something to do with it.
And I think
the alcohol had something
it keeps
to do
us in a place again of remembering we want to be sober-minded.
Yeah.
We want to go before the Lord with a clean conscience, with a sober mind, not with, intoxicated by the world's teaching, intoxicated by our own fleshly desires, intoxicated by literal fermented drink. We want to go before the Lord clean. And the rest of the chapter just kind of ends with Moses doing a little tidying up, making sure they're doing the offerings correct, making sure that everything's done in order.
One last thing on verse 10, it does say you're to make a distinction between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And the reason that's important is because we're getting ready to jump into chapter 11, which is going to kind of tack back to that. And so we have a word here. We have kadosh, which is holy and set apart. We have a word that's common. That's the word chol, and it means profaneness or commonness, unholy, that kind of thing. It's the opposite of holy. And then you have tameh, which is unclean, and that could be in multiple ways unclean.
Or impure, like ethically or religiously, ritually. Most of the times this is a ritual uncleaning.
Right.
It's not actually, and I think we do need to make this distinction, it doesn't mean you're necessarily in sin.
Correct.
It's what we're saying, for instance, there's prohibitions against touching the dead.
Right.
And when you touch the dead, you're unclean, and you have to go through a period of I think it's 7 days. At the end of the day, you're clean.
can
You
be
go
clean
through
most of the
washings
times,
and
yeah.
cleansing. We'll read about this. I think it's in next week's parsha.
Yeah.
We read about skin diseases
Yes.
and all of these things that make us ritually unclean. Not
Yeah.
necessarily that we're in sin,
Right. Sin,
but unclean.
and that's the difference kind of between this unholy versus holy.
Right.
That's when you get into sin and non-sin kind of
Right.
things versus clean and unclean. And
Mhm.
so the word tahor means clean or pure, and that's usually ceremonially.
Mhm.
It can be moral purity as well.
Right.
It has that in it. And it depends on the context of the passage, whether
Correct.
we're talking about something morally or something ritually speaking.
But the thing is this, we remember God is a God who does divide.
Yes.
I mean, we remember in creation, He divided the earth and the waters, the sky and the waters. He divided the day and night. He divides things to make distinctions.
Yeah.
And He divides out what is holy, what is unholy, what is clean, what is unclean.
Yeah.
So this is within the very character of who God is and the pattern that He set even in creation.
So with that, we move into chapter 11, and chapter 11 gets into it. The whole chapter is about the food laws for the people,
Right.
for Israel, for all of Israel, and actually not just for all of Israel. It's actually for foreigners as well, because when you go back and study the Torah, what you find out is the laws were built. The same teaching, Exodus 12 and verse 49 says the same teaching is going to apply equally to all the citizens and the foreigner living among you. So these laws are designed for everyone, not just for one person. And this gets into all these food laws. Now I want to give a quick, I'm not going to do a full food teaching here because this is our Parsha overview. We're just giving some pictures. We have some teachings on our website called Biblical Solutions. We have one called Eating the Biblical Way. It's 3 different teachings on this subject. And we're going to be adding some more things in the future to this idea so you can kind of get big pictures here. But one of the distinctions I want to help you make is you've probably heard the word kosher or kashrut. And kosher and kashrut, kosher refers to the food, kashrut refers to the laws. Kashrut laws are developed through the rabbinical system of Orthodox Judaism that has developed over the last 500 to 1,000 years, and even 2,000 years. There's a whole system of different types of eating, ways to eat, how things are cleaned or not cleaned, how pots and pans are used, which ones you can use, which ones you cannot use, all of those types of things. And there's a whole lot of kashrut. In other words, to be kashrut, there is a very detailed and very long list of what it means to eat and how to prepare food, not prepare food, prepare your home, prepare ovens, prepare sinks, all these different things. And that was developed by the rabbis. Okay, this is a rabbinical system. It is not what Leviticus 11 teaches. Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 17 speak of the biblical diet. What are you supposed to eat and what are you not supposed to eat? Kashrut is dealing with rabbinical laws, and you need to really know that. Kosher is a word that is talking about the types of foods that are allowed and not allowed. So we could say a kosher food, according to the Bible, is this.
Right.
But when you say the word kosher, it tends to lead people to the rabbinical system, and we do not teach the rabbinical system. We teach what we believe is the biblical system of food. And so with that, we kind of get into here, and we're going to just give a highlight. We're not going into details. Let me just give you a principle real quick. Number one, to understand the biblical laws of food, we have to ask ourselves a simple question. Who defines food?
Right.
Right? Food is defined by God.
Right.
God defines food.
Which is interesting to note that the very first law that was written that we read about in the Bible is a food law.
It's a food law.
And
And in fact, it's a food restriction.
You go all the way back to Genesis.
Yeah.
And what's the first law we read that he really gives is this restriction of do not eat from this tree.
Right.
It's
the
a
very first thing.
central part of the laws of God. It really does take center stage.
Yeah.
These food laws and these food rules that he gives, and what kinds of animals you can eat, what kinds of animals are clean,
Yeah.
and what kinds of animals are unclean. This is where that word clean and unclean comes into.
So two things before you go further and start reading that scripture. Hang on one sec. God defines food, and God can change the definition of food. What people want to do is they want to pigeonhole God. They want to pigeonhole God and say, okay, well, if God defines food, as soon as he says this is okay, then it's okay forever. Or if he says this is not okay, then it's not okay forever.
Right.
Let's just understand, there is a complete cycle that goes on in the scriptures with food. And God defines food for us as humans, and he changes that definition from time to time. He allows certain things at one time.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So in the very beginning of the garden, everything was vegetables and fruit. And in fact, it wasn't even all vegetables. There were a few vegetables that were still off limits. The garden had vegetables and fruit, and that was it. After they left the garden, they got exposed to more vegetables, but not all vegetables, but all the vegetables and all the fruits. So they had all fruits and limited vegetables in the garden. After that, they got all vegetables and all the fruit. Still no meat. When they get off the boat, when Noah gets off
After
the boat,
the flood.
At that point, now God says, I'm going to provide meat for you. And he uses the word all meat, but it's not all meat as we understand it. Because we would say, well, that means every animal was available. We understand, because of the words that we brought up earlier, clean and unclean. Noah had clean meat and
it actually
unclean.
Says that he brought clean and unclean animals onto the boat.
He already had animals that God had said, these are clean and these are unclean. Now, another rule that you have to just kind of know is simple. The food laws of the Bible are not all about physical health. Most of them, if you stick to those food laws, you will be healthier. There have been many studies done on this, and you can look up all these things yourself. There's a lot of studies, and you will be healthier if you stick to these. But understand that there are some animals allowed. There are some animals that are not allowed in the food laws that would not have been bad for us to eat. So they're not all necessarily, and that's why we trust God defines food. And there's certain animals, he just says, you can't eat those. So when Noah gets off the boat, he gets clean animals, unclean animals, and he says, now I'm going to tell you, you can slaughter any of these animals. And he's referring to the clean animals, because Noah understood that. And the reason he does that's pretty simple. The whole earth had been flooded. There hasn't been a growing season.
Right.
Unlike the garden where everything was built fully grown, now everything starts from a seed. So when they come off the boat, it's seed time and harvest. He's got to wait for a growing season, maybe even 2 growing seasons, to get food that he can do beyond what he's already brought from the ark that he was already growing. So it's going to take a little time. So God gives him meat. Then we move forward further, and we're going to find here Leviticus, the next process of food. And we find here in the summary of chapter 11, here's what you can eat and not eat without reading all the details.
I really think it sums it up in chapter 11, verse 45. He says, for I am Adonai who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is the Torah of the animal, the bird, every living creature that moves in the waters, and every creature that creeps on the earth. And if you read the verses ahead of that, he defines which ones they are.
And it's kind of simple. Can I say what it is real quick before you read that? Because that's really good. It's kind of simple. If an animal chews the cud and has a split hoof, i.e. a cow, you can eat it. That's it.
Think about a split hoof dividing good from evil, holy from unholy.
Very simple. Very simple. That's meat. Okay. And the fishes have
scales
and fins. If the fish has scales and fins, you can eat them. If it doesn't,
I'm just going to say for my southern friends who I love, if it has whiskers, that doesn't count. Don't hate me, don't hate me.
Even if you fry it. Okay? And when it comes to the birds of the air, you basically, with rare exceptions, stay away from the scavengers. You're not eating the eagles, you're not eating the crows, you're not eating those vultures, right? You're staying away from the scavengers. Other than that...
You didn't talk about the creepy things.
Okay.
The creeping things along the ground, the earth, they start in verse 29.
So the following are unclean: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great
Which
lizard,
is good.
the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Among all those that creep, these are the ones that are unclean. Whoever touches them, it'll be dead to you, etc. When you start studying those animals, you find out there are certain ones that have a certain number of legs you're allowed to eat, other ones with other legs you can't. It gets a little more crazy. But for those of us in the Western world,
right,
the diet of creepy things that crawl along the ground is not something we have to really get too much detail, because we typically don't eat that. So if you just stick to the basics, it's really not hard. It's an easy diet. It's not difficult. It's very healthy. And it is not countered in the New Testament. For that, you need to go to our teachings on eating the biblical way, where we actually talk about the New Testament scriptures that people have put in that say this says food is clean and everything's okay. There are good understandings there that I think you'll find surprising. Sherry, close us out with this verse here.
This parsha ends with this, and I'm going to back up to 46 just to read that so we have it all in context. This is the Torah of the animal, the bird, every living creature that moves in the waters, and every creature that creeps on the earth. Why? Why does God do this? He tells us to make a distinction between unclean and clean, and between the living thing that may be eaten and the living thing that may not be eaten. We see from verses 45 to 47, both of those words. I am holy, you are to be holy. Yes. You are to be set apart. The way you eat is going to be set apart and different from the pagan nations around you. I'm going to show you what animals I have defined as clean and what animals I define as unclean.
Yes.
So you're going to know how to live in holiness.
That's right.
And this is the love of God to us. He teaches us, not just in the animal world. This is one of the patterns we look at of how God teaches us and walks with us and shows us our life. He teaches us what is clean, what is unclean. For instance, think about the things that you listen to. What things would be deemed clean and what would be unclean? Some are good for you and some are not good for you. But what does that matter what I listen to, what I watch, what I engage in? Because if I engage in things that are unclean, it's going to draw me into an unholy state with God.
Yeah.
But if I'm listening to things that are beneficial to my spirit, that are beneficial to my life, if I'm engaging in activities that are clean before the Lord, I'm going to be able to follow this and be holy as He is holy.
Amen.
So it sets the pattern for us that the eating is a portion of it.
Yeah.
That is absolutely a part we should be looking at and following. But it plays into so much more of our life. As we learn that principle, we can apply it into every other area of our life.
That's exactly right. So study these biblical laws, study the biblical food laws. I think you're going to find your life enriched, not only health-wise, but certainly, as Sherry's talking about it, your heart becoming clean before the Lord. Until next time, everybody, God bless you and shalom.
Shalom.